Okay, so continuing on with the discussion of the relationship between common sense and scientific inquiry, Dewey says, I begin the discussion by introducing and explaining the denotative force of the word situations. What kinds of things, what are we pointing to in the world when we talk about a situation? Situation is one of the very important keywords in Dewey's work. We'll also talk later on about, give a technical definition of denotation, but we're not going to worry too much about that yet. That will come much later, the difference between things like denotation and connotation. But basically, what are we talking about when we're using the word situation? What are we looking at in the world? And he says, its import may perhaps be most readily indicated by means of a preliminary negative statement. So what is designated by the word situation is not a single object or event or set of objects and events. For we never experience nor form judgments about objects and events in isolation, but only in connection with a contextual whole. Right, so it's not one thing. When we're talking about a situation, it's not one thing, one event that we're talking about. It's the contextual whole out of which we discern, perceive individual objects or events. So this latter, this contextual whole, is what is called a situation. I have mentioned the extent in which modern philosophy has been concerned with the problem of existence as perceptually and conceptually determined. The confusions and fallacies that attend the discussion of this problem have a direct and close connection with the differences between an object and a situation. So, difference between an object and a situation. These are two separate ways of conceptualizing what's going on when we respond to the world. Psychology has paid much attention to the question of the process of perception and has, for its purpose, described the perceived object in terms of the results of analysis of the process. So psychology at this time was interested in the process of perception. He says, described the perceived object in terms of what you get when you analyze the process of perceiving the world. And then he goes on. So I pass over the fact that no matter how legitimate the virtual identification of process and product may be for the special purpose of psychological theory, the identification is thoroughly dubious as a generalized ground of philosophical discussion and theory. So that is the identification of the object of perception and the process of perception. So it may be useful for psychological investigation, but it creates problems in a broader philosophical perspective. So he's going to pass over this, and he does so. I do so in order to call attention to the fact that by the very nature of the case, the psychological treatment takes a singular object or event for the subject matter of its analysis. So when psychologists study perception, they're looking at the perception of a particular object, a singular object or event. In actual experience, however, there is never any such isolated singular object or event. An object or event is always a special part, phase, or aspect of an environing experienced world, a situation. So when you're talking about situation, it's the environing experienced world in which objects exist as particular parts or phases or aspects. And so is often different from how psychologists will study perception. They'll look at how we perceived a particular object, isolating that from the rest of the world. But in everyday circumstances, of course, we're not in a kind of isolated, we don't come to objects in isolation. They're part of a broader world that is influencing us and that we are acting in. The singular object stands out conspicuously because of its especially focal and crucial position at a given time in determination of some problem of use or enjoyment which the total complex environment presents. So when we are aware of a particular object, it's because it's really important for figuring out what to do in some situation. Problems of use or enjoyment, which mark practical situations, as we've seen now many times in Dewey's in this chapter. So there was always a field. Let's see. There is always a field in which observation of this or that object or event occurs. Observation of the latter is made for the sake of finding out what that field is with reference to some active, adaptive response to be made in carrying forward a course of behavior. So again, talking about this contextual whole, this complex environment, the total complex environment in which we observe some particular object or other, or some particular happening, some event. And we observe those particular things, kind of analyze them or perceive them out of the whole matrix, the whole environment we are in, for the sake of some adaptive response to continue on with our course of behavior. One has only to recur to animal perception occurring by means of sense organs to note that isolation of what is perceived from the course of life behavior would be not only futile but obstructive, in many cases fatally so. So the point of perceiving in kind of ordinary situations is to act on the basis of that. It's not just to perceive what is there, but it's to perceive what is there in the course of some life behavior. And so if we were to, if we needed to isolate everything out for some reason, that would be obstructive to the ongoings of our behaviors. If we were just isolating our food completely out of the environment for whatever purpose, and something like this happens in aesthetic perception, but this is not Dewey's book on aesthetics. And something a little bit like this happens in science as well, as we'll see later on. But in ordinary behavior, the purpose is not to isolate out some little bit of the environment as kind of the end in itself. We're trying to pass over into adaptive behaviors. We want to get the food into our mouths and into our stomachs. And in that way, it's connected to what comes before, our hunger or whatever, our searchings for food, and to what comes after, our satisfaction. So it's not a kind of in itself thing. It's a part of a whole life process within a total environment. Anyway, continuing on, I think the last paragraph I'll do here. So, a further conclusion follows, he says. When the act and object of perception are isolated from their place and function in promoting and directing a successful course of activities in behalf of use enjoyment, they are taken to be exclusively cognitive. And here it gets a little bit confusing. I think he's talking about the kind of general philosophical position as opposed to his own philosophical position, although maybe this would be compatible. I mean, this is not how things are done in ordinary situations. But if you were to isolate the object of perception, you could call that exclusively cognitive. And of course, nothing is in reality exclusively cognitive. But there might be some situations in which the cognitive aspect is emphasized. But anyway, if you were to be able to purely isolate the object from its situation, you could call that exclusively a kind of like pure cognition or something. The perceived object, orange, rock, piece of gold, or whatever, is taken to be an object of knowledge per se, in the sense of being discriminatingly noticed. It is an object of knowledge, but not of knowledge as ultimate and self-sufficient. It is noted or known only so far as guidance is thereby given to direction of behavior. I think he's kind of switched into the ordinary situation here. So objects are kind of an ordinary situation. An object is known so far as it guides our behavior, or noticed, right? Kind of as just discriminating it from other things in an environment. It then is known in the sense of guiding, being able to guide our behavior. So that the situation in which it is found can be appropriately enjoyed, or some of its conditions be so used that enjoyment will result, or suffering be obviated. It is only when an object of focal observation is regarded as an object of knowledge in isolation that there arises the notion that there are two kinds of knowledge, and two kinds of objects of knowledge, so opposed to each other that philosophy must either choose which is real or find some way of reconciling their respective realities. So when we take like a focal observation, which is emphasizing the cognitive aspect, when that's regarded as something totally different, I think, from the ordinary situation where we're noting differences in the environment in order to perform adaptive activities, in order to figure out how to act, how to use something, how to enjoy something. There's not like an absolute split there. If we are to make an absolute split, it again causes philosophical problems. It seems to be that there's two different kinds of knowings, two different kinds of objects, two kinds of objects of knowledge totally opposed to each other, or so opposed to each other that philosophers have to argue about which one is real, or figure out two different kinds of realities. And Dewey's going to say that there's just one reality which we can approach in various ways, and to approach something in kind of the common sense way is different than to approach something in the scientific way, but that doesn't mean there's fundamentally two different kinds of things that we need to reconcile. It's just two different ways of attending to reality. When it is seen that in common sense inquiry there is no attempt made to know the object or event as such, but only to determine what it signifies with respect to the way in which the entire situation should be dealt with, the opposition and conflict do not arise. Right? So here's another good kind of explanation or definition of common sense inquiry, in which we're not attempting to fully isolate an object from its environment, but determine, as he says, what it signifies, or quote unquote means, although we use meaning and signification differently, but what it signifies, what it guides us, how it guides us with respect to the entire situation, which is not something that's totally opposed to scientific, the more scientific isolation of an object from the environment in order to study it in itself. The object or event in question is perceived as part of the environing world in common sense inquiry, right? As part of the environing world, not in and by itself. it is rightly, validly perceived if and when it acts as clue and guide in use enjoyment. So we perceive the world correctly when we are able to use bits of the environment to guide our use and enjoyment of that environment. Again, this is talking about common sense or kind of ordinary life activities. We live and act in connection with the existing environment, not in connection with isolated objects, even though a singular thing may be crucially significant in deciding how to respond to total environment. Right. So I'm going to stop here because the next section is kind of long. It's a little bit difficult to divide these sections up for the purpose of explaining them and talking about them. This last paragraph was a little bit confusing. The beginning of it, I think, is a little bit confusing. But again, he's drawing this contrast and relation between the scientific view, where we're often trying to isolate things in order to study them more carefully, study their relations to other things, and common sense inquiry, where we're trying to make use of the environment, enjoy the environment, and this can involve making discriminations, making distinctions among things, focusing on particular things that might be especially important for satisfying our urges and whatever other living processes we're engaged in. Okay, so I'll stop here and then pick up the next kind of longer section in the next video. That's all for now.